Okay, so I want to welcome people to the fifth episode of our Vygotsky seminar. I have a live face-to-face seminar at the University of New Mexico, and the way I do it is I do a presentation, and then through a process I like to call co-thinking, the students and I go um, talk about the ideas, the concepts. They add to my understanding. They also can let me know places that aren't particularly clear. And then I put together this recording for people to watch online. And this week we're going to talk about two important concepts. Vygotsky writes a lot about qualitative transformations, and that was a key concept this week when we looked at the periods of crisis or critical periods in child development. And being has been an aspect, an important concept from the very beginning of the seminar. And so we'll focus on both of those things. And last week, we talked about how both early humans and individual children gain meaning through interaction and using languaging with words, meaningful words, how both of the species and the individual develops. And that's captured in this phrase, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And as always, we go back to the the etymological dictionary to look at the origin of words. And so ontogeny, onto is the Greek to be, and it comes from the Proto-Indo-European root S, which is also to be. And it's really easy to see how that concept is the foundation for the concept of essence, which is an essential part of our seminar. And then for philo, it comes from the Greek tribe. And the Proto-Indo-European, again, is to be and existing and growing. The difference here is that the onto is the individual and the philo is the grouping. And the last part of the word, Jenny, is Genesis. It's a clear derivation there. Proto-Indo-European gene, which is to give birth or beget. And it's used not just for procreation, but also for family structures and tribal structures, tribal groupings. And so those are those two words. And while the person who put this together, this concept, Haeckel, is talking about biology, in a few minutes, we'll talk about it in relationship to cognition. So his hypothesis was that the development of the embryo of an animal from fertilization to gestation or hatching, that's the ontogeny. So again, he's talking about in the embryo and before birth goes through stages within that represent or resemble the successive adult stages in the evolution of the animal's remote ancestors. So it's saying that what's happening with the embryo goes through the similar steps that the ancient ancestors went through as adults or led through adults. Well, he came up with the concept of phylum. And I wanted to focus in on this because there was something I found quite interesting when I was investigating this. And you can see how high up phylum is in the order. The top is the kingdom with animals, and then there's the fungi and plants. And then the phylum is the chordates, those that animals with a backbone. You can see how far down Homo sapiens is. But when I looked in Wikipedia and other sources, when they were talking about this concept of phylum, they said that this uh, Eichel got it from the Greek word meaning race, but the Greeks had no concept of race. And the Eichel used the German term Stamm, which they then again say means race. I did the Google Translate, and 10 different concepts came up under Stamm, and not one of them was remotely related to race. But it gives us a clear picture of how this concept just is invidious and comes into our language and our concepts. And it's a concept that has absolutely no scientific foundation. The idea that you can divide all of humanity up into 4 or 5 groups based on physical characteristics is absurd. The concept arose, the word race originally meant people with language, people who spoke a different language. But then when especially the Portuguese and the Spaniards invaded, colonized South and Latin America, they used a justification for the slaughter that they were committing against the indigenous populations. Massive civilizations that had science, art, high culture, agriculture, architecture, and the calendar, mathematics, the writing systems, they were wiped out. And the justification for wiping them out and the murdering them was that they were pagans, that they did not believe in Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. And the purpose of Christ's teachings is to convert and people to Christianity. And the Spanish and Portuguese did that with their missionaries. But then how do you continue to justify the slaughter if they're now Christians? They're not pagans. And this is where the whole concept of race was constructed, that they were of a lower status. They were lower. They were inferior. And because they were inferior, it was okay to continue to oppress them and brutalize them. And the gold and the silver that was ripped off from these empires, these civilizations, that was the funding, that was the development of capitalism. That was the primary source of capital to build the factories and to build the industrial revolution. And so right from the start, the foundation is based on this exploitation. And so I thought it was interesting how this concept of race has come in, because I think it's important for us to differentiate the concept of race, which is not scientific, it has no foundation, and racism, which has been used by the rulers in this country to divide the population in order to continue to maintain their rule. And that racism is pervasive, from the colonialization, the brutalization, and the genocide of the native population here, the slavery, the importation of essentially slave labor from China and from Mexico. That's the foundation, and that racism is built into all of the institutions, educational, the media, and the legislative, the judicial. It's impossible to not be affected by it living in this country. And I think it's important to recognize the racism, but not to have this concept of race, which has no scientific foundation. So, as I was mentioning, cognition, and cognition is one of those terms that we use a lot, and we're not always sure about exactly the precise meaning. And we talked about it in the groups. And the reason we're talking about cognition is that we're now going to look at the relationship between ontogeny and phylogeny as far as cognitive development. And so the groups came up with this definition that cognition is the process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experience, and the senses. And here it's always important to, like we've done throughout, looking at the difference between the animal world and the human world. And so my contention is that the animal world does not have cognition because they don't have that understanding through thinking. That's a higher level of abstract thinking that comes with human languaging. So cognition then is this process of how we take all this information in and perceive it and then act on it. And so the task that was presented to the different groups is to look at how ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny and cognitive development. And people came up with some good ideas looking at the similarities and the contrast. And Vygotsky makes a point that there's two fundamental differences between the process that the species goes through and the process that individuals go through. And that first difference is that the individual child has an existing language environment. Language already exists in the world into which they are born. Whereas early humans, there was no language. They had languaging processes with gestures and grunts and signs and symbols, but they didn't have the language, developed language as a model. They had to create it. And so that's a fundamental difference. The other big difference he points out is that the early humans had developed biologically pretty much to the point that there's not a whole lot of difference between them and modern humans. And so there's that biological development, then the cultural development that came about with languaging. And they had culture before languaging, but there's a different kind of culture that existed with the acquisition of meaningful language. The individual child, she is going through both a cultural development, gaining language, which is very much cultural. At the same time, she's going through a biological development. And those are two fundamental differences. And people in the seminar also pointed out that the different kinds of social formations, more advanced social formations, would also play a role in a big difference between these two. So a student posed this question in our blog in our online community. And the challenge was in a sentence or two, explain the meaning of the phrase, a dialectical understanding of the process, the concept of process, without using the word dialectic. And this word dialectic is one that is thrown around. I've talked before about the zone of proximal development being the most used and least understood concept in educational thought. And dialectic is similarly used a lot with not a whole lot of understanding. And so this is an important challenge here. And so the groups discussed it. And then I presented my sentence. The concept process reflects the general principles of the universe. And we talked about this last week, that the universe comes into existence and there are forces and principles and patterns and order that come into existence with the universe. The laws that are behind that development are the laws that are dialectical laws. They're dialectical because they incorporate the concept of contradiction. And so these general principles are that everything comes into existence through unification of matter, governed by the basic forces in the universe. And in its development, it undergoes qualitative transformations and must be processed, must be conceptualized ontologically to reveal its essence. And ontologically here means that we're looking at abstractly looking at the process. We're not just looking at the manifestations, we're looking at the process. So these laws of non-being, being, non-being is fundamental to the universe. That's one of the laws of dialectics. The unification of opposites, different aspects, the particles, the protons, coming together, that unification is governed by the basic forces of the universe. And then in developing the qualitative transformations, and this is key, that development is not just linear, it's not just evolution, it's revolution, that there's a fundamental change that brings about something new. And that's the qualitative transformation. That is dialectics there. And again, the ontology reveals its essence. And we looked further at the dialectical process, and a number of students raised the question about what does Aufheben mean, and the equally indecipherable English sublation. And there's the three conflicting, contradictory concepts that are captured in this one word. And it's not that this one word can mean one or two or three, it's that this word means all of these things. And it's to raise up, to lift, and that's this idea of it, a foundation, that it provides, there's the roots, and it grows from this foundation. And in this lifting up, this growing, there's also an abolishing, a canceling out of that which came before, that which it's being raised from. But at the same time, it's preserving, it's saving aspects of that which is being abolished and that which it is being raised up from. You cannot, with formal logic, conceive or conceptualize or write into syllogisms or logical propositions, these three contradictory concepts. Instead, you need dialectical logic, which embraces contradiction. And we've looked at this before with the elementary mental functions with which a child is born. And these elementary mental functions are for all life that has a mind. But these involuntary attention, the visual perception, and mechanical memory, that provides the foundation. That is the rising up of these elementary mental functions in the creation of the higher psychical processes. The higher psychical processes grow from this foundation, yet they annul it, they cancel it, so that the mechanical memory is transformed, it's canceled. It becomes mediated memory, mediated by language. We looked last time at the visual perception and how that is changed with verbal perception. So that's the abolishing, but then the keeping and preserving involuntary attention, mechanical memory, and visual perception are still part of the higher psychical processes, but they're in a completely different relationship. This process we can also look at in our orange, where the DQT is the dialectical qualitative transformation. APP is the appearance. The C and C are categories and concepts related to that particular appearance. So their categories and concepts are for the bud. It has its own the concepts and categories that define, capture bud, and those are different from, yet the same as the flower. And so this process of looking at these qualitative transformations is huge. That's what process is about. The appearance is epistemological. That is, it's something that is observed, it's phenomenon, it can be measured. The process cannot be measured. It's abstract. And so science tends to not look at process and instead just focuses on the appearance. And in so doing, they're missing the essence, the essence that the maroon, that is the essence, that's the process. And so this process for everything in the universe is born, it comes into existence, goes through qualitative transformations and development, goes out of existence, where it dies and then becomes part of the energy in the universe. And so looking at it through the process is looking at it ontologically. And we can use this same concept to look at our universe. So the unified energy field is the foundation from which our universe arises, grows, but the universe, the development of the universe, abolishes, cancels aspects of the unified energy field. It is no longer unified because at the beginning of the universe, there's the separation of those strong force, the weak nuclear force, electromagnetism, and then with the advent of the universe, the gravitational field. So that annuls the unified character of it, but it preserves the principles and the forces that are part of it. And so we can see from the universe to the orange, this process here, fundamental process, it governs everything. And this is the dialectical process. The same can be looked at with humans and the early humans, and for the bonobos for the social formation, where the conceptual neuronal network that the early humans had was the foundation for the development of this conceptual understanding in the neuronal network. And so this, again, it's the lifting up, the abolishing, and the preserving. So these aspects from the animal kingdom are still very much a part of what makes us human. And then we looked at this concept, looking at Vygotsky's theory of the crisis and the age levels. And each one of these squares represents a dialectical, qualitative transformation. And Vygotsky talks about the stable periods where there's a growth that goes along. And as opposed to many other developmental theories in early child development, it's not linear. Children when they're born or age 1 or 3, they do not have the same mode of thinking as adults. And it's not just a question of adding more information. It's a question of the qualitative transformation that takes place in their thinking process. And that's the key piece here, is this mode, this way of thinking, how this whole apparatus, the sensing, transducing, the perceiving, judging, and acting with affect, how is that, that all goes to make up a mode of thinking. And there's a different mode of thinking at age 1, age 3, 7, 13, and 17. And this concept is key to understanding Vygotsky's concept of the zone of proximal development, because the zone of proximal development for children at each different age level will be fundamentally different. And that's why you can't just take this one concept and then just apply it willy-nilly through all age groups. And then, so age 1, the big change is getting up and 2 feet, walking and exploring the world, having a different perspective. Age 3, with the languaging developing, but it's also this concept of self, of me, mine, and that happens at this period. And when we talk about crisis, there's the terrible twos, and that's what is leading into this period. And these aren't fixed so that on the 3rd birthday, one is going to have this qualitative transformation. It's a process, but that process reaches a culminating point. It's the quantity turning into a qualitative transformation. And that qualitative transformation is a rearranging of the whole perceptual, conceptual system, the mode of thinking that the child has. And then going to school at Vygotsky says age 7, and that's when the time at which children went to kindergarten in the Soviet Union, and I believe they still do. But it's there that they're introduced to both academic concepts, the math and the literacy and other science concepts, but they're also introduced to a fundamentally different social relationship as they have to negotiate self and interactions in a fundamentally different way. And that academic concepts brings about a shift in thinking. And a student asked a question about, well, what if they don't go to school? Which was a very good question, because early humans, and for until just very recently, children didn't go to school. They participated in the community and the production in the community. And I was just over dinner this evening listening to a talk by Michael Tomasello, who's done a lot of work on child development, and especially in relationship to chimps. And I think that he doesn't distinguish between the chimps and bonobos, which is an important thing to do. But he studies the child development, and he was saying that it was at the age of 6 or 7, based on his research to a lot of different cultures, that it's at that age that children are expected to take on more tasks of participating in activities, whether it's in the field or the cooking or pottery or tool making or domestication of animals. They take, and in taking those on, are introduced to the concepts that are behind whatever techniques are being used in the production. There is an interesting example of how the concepts that children come to school with, the everyday concepts, butt up against the academic concepts. So, that you have an everyday concept that the sun rises, or that the earth is flat. And you go to the school and you get a different concept. And so this little girl, Jenny, comes home after, I don't know, kindergarten or first grade. And mom says, well, Jenny, what did you learn in school today? And she said, we learned that the earth is round like a pancake. And so right there, you can see the taking that everyday concept of flat and the academic concept of round, and how she put those two together. And a lot of education through the years is that negotiation between the concepts that one has from one's culture, one's upbringing, just spontaneously, and academic concepts. And then at age 13, there's a number of people raised questions about puberty, and how delayed puberty is, or delayed reproduction and earlier puberty has affected this period of transformation. And we'll talk about that when we talk about adolescence in more depth. But the key here is this concept of thinking in concepts. And that's a hard concept to wrap one's head around. But Vygotsky uses this example of, with mathematics, there's a symbol and an object. So you've got one and you've got orange. And so you're looking at that relationship between symbols and objects, concrete objects. With algebra, you're looking at the relationship between two abstract concepts, two symbols, A and B, and that relationship. In order to do that kind of thinking, one has to hold in one's mind the one concept in order to be able to compare it with another concept. And that's a different kind of thinking. That's thinking with concepts or in concepts. And that's a fundamental shift that takes place in adolescence. And the problem is that educators aren't aware of this fundamental shift in the thinking process, and therefore they can't effectively teach students. And this was demonstrated in the Albuquerque public school system a number of years ago. They did a survey, and 61% of all students across all schools failed Algebra 1. And the reason wasn't the student's fault, it was the teacher's fault. And the teachers were at fault because they did not understand the role that they had to play in helping to make the thinking necessary to do algebra transparent to the students. And this is a key concept of the zone of proximal development, of making the thinking that you're doing as an expert peer, as an adult, as a teacher, the thinking as a parent, the thinking that you're going through to get a concept across, by making that transparent to the student or the child, it's helping them in their zone of proximal development, because that intellectual imitation is key to that concept. So instead of teachers making transparent their thinking process to, now I am thinking, now I have to, they would do problems on the board, and students would begin to pick it up, but they wouldn't gain an understanding of it. And that's why this Vygotsky's theory is so important. And we talked a little bit about the transition at age 17. He didn't, I should say, qualitative transformation, because it's not just a transition, it's a transformation. He didn't write about that because he was concerned with child development, and this went beyond that. But in Russia at that time, I was an age at which students would go out and start working and get a job and get married, and that brought about a qualitative change in their perspective, their thinking. It's similar when students go to college for the first time and they're on their own. They have to, it's a different environment. They have to take more responsibility. And I think something that is important for a lot of the students who are in the seminar, who are teaching adults in English as a foreign language or a second language, is the idea that their students have a heightened awareness of their own learning process. And that can be both positive and negative. It can be negative in that if they have a concept that the way to learn a language is to learn grammar and the rules, they will be resistant to approaches that use a lot more of a communicative approach and don't focus on the grammar instruction that a lot of us got in our foreign language classes in high school and college, and we'd take 2 or 3 years and barely be able to find our way to the bathroom in a foreign country. And so it can be an obstacle to learning, but it is that awareness of one's own learning. And we posed this question about what role has belief played in human development a number of sessions ago, and we'll look at that a little bit more in depth. But before doing so, I want to look at this concept of meaning again that we started on last week. And some people raise this question of what does Vygotsky mean when he says meaning is not equal to the word nor equal to the thought? And we'll go into this a lot more next week when we look at the thinking languaging system. But Vygotsky talks about an internal plane of meaning and an external plane of meaning. And they go in different directions, but they meet, they overlap, and meaning is the place at which they overlap. So a thought is being expressed through meaning that it is manifest in the word. But the meaning itself is not equal to the word nor the thought. It partakes of them, but they're not identical. And so that's a clarification we went through. And then we looked at this concept of being that is inherent in meaning. And we discussed this a bit, and it's a difficult concept. The idea is that when the rock, these sound waves represent a rock, it's freeing the humans from the fixed visual field. That is, that their visual perception isn't the determining factor in their cognitive process. Verbal perception becomes the key thing. It doesn't mean visual perception isn't still very important, but it's the verbal perception. That verbal perception takes an object like a rock out of this, Vygotsky talks about the diffused whole scene in the field of vision. It takes it out and gives it an existence. It exists separately. All objects in the environment then begin to have meaning, and in having that meaning, they have existence because they have a past. You can, with the concept of being, of meaning, there's being is part of that concept. So the rock's existence is part of the meaning because it has a past, a present, and a future. It exists. It's a process. And that process is its being. There's not a full awareness of that being at the beginning, but this, I believe, is the cornerstone for human consciousness. This concept of being that's part of meaning. And with the being, this is why we've focused so much in the seminar on being, starting with Heraclitus, and he looked at being as logos, and it didn't mean the word, it meant nature, meant all of nature, it meant the universe, it meant the being that exists in the universe. And we saw that with Spinoza, how he looked at the universe and being, that the fundamental part of the universe is being, that being is manifest in all matter, so that orange has being because it exists. And so understanding this concept of being is huge for human development. And that awareness starts off, all animals have awareness. And I think this is a sort of the foundation for consciousness. Awareness is the ability to survive in their environment so that you are aware of this information that's coming in, and that awareness leads you to the perceiving and to activity for survival. That's awareness. That's the foundation for consciousness, not human consciousness, but a consciousness that's in that awareness. So with meaning, there's an awareness that an object has being. There's a next step is the awareness of being. And that's where Heraclitus and the Greek philosophers Parmenides stepped in to look at the concept of being, and again, Spinoza. And so that awareness of the awareness of being is a fundamental part of this qualitative transformation to human consciousness. It builds upon that initial awareness of being that's in the first words, whether it's an object or an action or a relationship, because a lot of the first words were describing relationships, especially within the matrilineal clan. This meaning brings about joint attention, and this is a very important piece for looking at child development as well. That joint attention, the word draws attention. This is your bottle. And so that attention is on that object. That joint attention is what leads to mutual understanding, so that the communication of these sound waves, bottle, then is mutually understood by the caregiver and the child as representing this particular object. And having that kind of joint attention brings about joint goals and then joint collaboration, which is huge for the social formations that humanity comes up with. And those social groupings also have being, so that when you can put a word on a grouping, a tribe, or a family, that then gives that social formation, organization, being. And then you understand it as an entity. And this is very important in the development of the human social formations, because there's this conflict between the individual need and the social need. And how that's negotiated is key for development of morals, mores, codes, laws, ways of existing, ways of being. And that's where religion and those beliefs played a very big role. And then in communication, you become aware that you're communicating to another individual. You become aware of that other individual's existence. They have a being. And in that awareness, you also are aware that you have being. I am. That small little sentence there is really huge. The I, the concept of self, the concept of personality. And Vygotsky will talk more about personality, but personality is this whole development of self. It's not traits that one is born with. And then am is the being. I exist. And that's a process that the 3-year-old is going through, gaining an understanding of I exist. And that I in relationship to others is key at age 7 when you begin, or earlier, going to school. And that I is huge for adolescents. They become, as they think in concepts, they become aware of their own thinking processes. And as they become aware of their own thinking processes, they're aware that someone else is going through and has similar thinking processes. And that's where the relationships in adolescence change fundamentally, because of this shift in their way of thinking and their recognition of the I. Marx and Engels, in their German ideology, tie this all together. And they write, language is as old as consciousness. Language is practical consciousness that exists also for other humans. And for that reason alone, it really exists for me personally as well. Language, like consciousness, only arises from the need, the necessity of intercourse with other humans. Where there exists a relationship, it exists for me. And so that really captures what we were talking about, the interrelationship between language and consciousness, and language, consciousness, and social formation. And the need is increased exponentially with the development of agriculture and the domestication of animals. It's interesting. The Marx and Engels got together when they were 28 and 32, respectively, in Brussels, and wrote this book. And what they're doing is trying to take all of human understanding that they could get their hands on. And Marx learned Russian just so that he could read this one article on this concept of quit rent that he was investigating. And they looked at all of the top political economists, the top philosophers, the top social theorists, and took things from their writings that matched reality and fit in, and things that didn't, they discarded and built this methodology that they didn't call dialectical materialism, but has been referred to as dialectical materialism. They was all set to publish the book, but then the revolutions of 1848 broke out across Europe, and the publisher got cold feet, and Marx was commissioned to write the Communist Manifesto. And Marx has this wonderful phrase where he says, the manuscript was placed on the shelf where it was subjected to the gnawing criticism of mice. I loved that when I first came across it. So in understanding the being, existence of human social formations, we looked at care, and that I'm convinced that the early humans were based on a matrilineal clan, matrilineal care, much like the bonobos, that if they had the aggressive dominant male fighting for access to females that the chimps had, they would never have survived, and we would not be here today listening to a talk. And so that concept of care is really important. I was interested when I went and looked at the etymology of it, that it seemed sort of contradictory at first, that it's anxious and lament and grief and crying out and screaming. But then if you think about it in terms of the process that we go through with death and that kind of grief, it reflects the kind of care, the notion that we have today of it. And I have a doctoral student from Russia, Anya, who is doing her dissertation on authentic care in the foreign language classroom. And so when we were discussing, we thought, well, what does authentic mean? And we looked it up, and it, as you can see, original, genuine, principle. And so it's looking at what's natural, the innate, and it comes from the PIE root gene, to give birth, beget. And so this concept of authentic care is also very important to teaching, all teaching. And I think that's when I've talked in the past about making a human connection. That human connection is not just the demographics, it's showing the kind of care and respect to students that allows the kind of reciprocity, co-thinking that really brings about effective teaching and learning. So there's been all kinds of explanations of being. One of them was magical thinking, that if something grows or something happens in nature and something else was taking place coincidentally, that coincidence is viewed as causing that event. And it's similar to me putting on a particular t-shirt when I'm watching the Denver Broncos and thinking that my wearing that t-shirt is going to affect the outcome of the game. That's magical thinking. And I have when you think about professional sports, and I think about Marx and Engels talking about religion being the opiate of the masses. And then nowadays, professional sports and entertainment serve as that opiate. So millions of people are sitting worried and talking about and concerned about highly conditioned athletes putting on their armor and going out and doing battle and inflicting bodily harm on others and themselves to the roaring approval of 100,000 in the stadium and millions and many millions watching. And these athletes are all making huge amounts of money, and the billionaires are making huge amounts of money. But if people are thinking about that all the time, they're not thinking about their social conditions, their jobs, their lack of jobs, the healthcare, education, the climate, those things that are really important to humanity. And those things don't get looked at. And that's the rulers in this country love the fact that people are not thinking about those things as much, and trying to find the answers and organizing to bring about change as they are thinking about the outcome of a sporting event. So when we think about being, the concept of spirit, that these inanimate, animate objects have being, is an important one. And Natalia, another Russian student of mine who's been very helpful in digging into the Russian to help me to understand what the real concept was that Vygotsky was getting at, put together this slide for me. And you can read through that spirit is the mind, the moral side, and then another meanings are the non-material beginning of life, which is an interesting, the non-material beginning of life. We're talking about being there, existing. And then what we talk about, Vygotsky talks about more, the parashivanya, and that's a concept that we'll get into in more in depth. But with all life, there's a boundary, the boundary between the organism and the external, the internal and the external. And that interface is parashivanya, how that information is coming in, how it's being processed, but also how it leads to activity. And affect is a big part of that. And so you can see it ends with the concept of soul. And soul ties in with the psyche. And we can see the Greek, the soul, the mind, the spirit, life itself. And then the way that we're using it, Vygotsky's using it, is this understanding, the mind, the faculty of reason. And it's interesting, the PIE root is this blow. It's the breath of life. It's the life force, the vital force comes through the psyche. And and we're using it to refer to that which humans have, because they have languaging with meaning. And then it's interesting to look at belief, where in the 12th century it became a faith and religion. But if you go back to the PIE, to care, desire, to love. And so finally, we looked at, and we're going to continue looking at, religious explanations of being. And this gives a breakdown of the world's main religions, with Christians at 32%, Muslims at 21%, Hindus at 13%, Buddhists at about 6%, other religion, many indigenous religions at 12.5%, and then the non-religious at 14%. And this shows a distribution, with the light blue being mostly the Roman Catholic, and the darker red, the Protestant, and then the Eastern Orthodox up in Russia and beyond. And then the Sunni and the Shia, we can see in the darker green, and the maroon, the two different strands, belief systems, organized religions of the factions, the Sunni and the Shia, and there's conflicts there. Then the Hinduism in India, and then the Buddhist in the far and near East, and then in Africa, a mix of the Muslim, Christian. And there's, what we decided to do was to divide up into 6 groups. And Judaism is in there because Jewish thought is fundamental for Islamic thought or Muslim thought and Christianity. And even though Jews make up 2.2% of the population, their influence has been tremendous, as reflected in this seminar, with 3 central peoples, Spinoza, Marx, and Vygotsky, all being Jewish. And then each group is going to take a religion and then put together a slide or 2 that they'll present next week, that looks at the origin of the religion, its view on supreme beings, its story that creation, myths or narratives, what happens with death, who are the prophet or prophets, and is there an immortal soul, and then the basic teachings. And so that's where we will look at the beginning of next week, and then we'll go into the thinking languaging system, which is fundamental. So until next week, I hope everybody enjoys themselves. I will end it here.